Welcome to Stories of the Slavery. Today's journey takes us to the year 1859, where we follow Seraphina Drake, an enslaved black girl whose beauty became her curse. The mistress couldn't stand the attention Seraphina drew, and what she did next was beyond cruel. For 10 long years, she kept her chained and hidden away. This is an intense and difficult story, so take a moment, breathe, and listen closely. Before we start, remember to subscribe to the channel and drop a comment telling us which city and country you're listening from. Your participation helps ensure these stories are remembered, not buried. Let's begin. In the spring of 1859, in a small cabin behind the Whitmore plantation in Warren County, Mississippi, a baby girl was born with amber-colored eyes and skin that seemed to glow even in dim candlelight. Her mother, a field slave named Ruth, looked at her newborn daughter and felt something she had rarely known in her 32 years of bondage: fear. Not the ordinary fear of the overseer's whip or the master's temper, this was a different terror. With an instinct only a mother possesses, Ruth understood that her daughter's extraordinary beauty would be either her salvation or her destruction. She named the child Seraphina, after the highest order of angels, a word she had heard the plantation mistress read years before from a book of religious poetry. Ruth could not read or write, but she never forgot that name. Seraphina, the burning ones, the angels closest to God. That first night, she whispered it into her daughter's ear, praying heaven might protect what she knew she could not. The Whitmore plantation sprawled across 1,800 acres of the richest cotton land in the Mississippi Delta. On a gentle rise overlooking the field stood the main house, a 2-story Greek Revival mansion with white columns and wide verandas that seemed to mock the suffering that built its grandeur. In 1859, the plantation held 147 enslaved people and produced nearly 500 bales of cotton each year, making the Whitmore family one of the wealthiest in the region. The master was Colonel James Whitmore, 63 years old, known for running what he called a tight operation. He rarely visited the slave quarters, leaving daily management to his overseers and his wife. James spent most of his time in Vicksburg on business and political matters. He'd served 2 terms in the Mississippi state legislature and considered himself a gentleman of the highest order. He owned human beings as casually as he owned horses or furniture, never questioning the morality of the institution that made him rich. But true power in the Whitmore household lay not with the colonel, but with his wife, Helena. 41 years old in 1859, she had once been hailed as the most beautiful debutante in Natchez society. Time and disappointment had hardened her features and poisoned her heart. She had given her husband 3 sons, all surviving to adulthood, an accomplishment she held above all else. Yet Helena lived with a secret bitterness that colored everything. She watched her beauty fade in the mirror each morning, the fine lines, the slight loosening of her jaw, and she could not bear it. Helena ruled the domestic slaves with an iron hand. She personally supervised every house servant, cooks, laundresses, nursemaids, priding herself on maintaining what she called proper order, which meant complete submission from every enslaved person inside her home. The field slaves answered to the overseers, the house slaves answered to Helena. And Helena answered to no one. For the first 7 years of her life, Seraphina lived in relative obscurity. She stayed with her mother in their small cabin, where Ruth worked as a laundress, 14 brutal hours a day washing, boiling, and pressing the Whitmore family's linens and fine clothing. Ruth's hands were permanently scarred from lye soap and scalding water, but she kept her daughter close, teaching her to stay quiet, stay invisible, stay alive. Seraphina learned these lessons well. She helped carry water from the well, sorted dirty laundry, folded sheets without a single wrinkle. She learned to walk softly, speak only when spoken to, never look a white person directly in the eye. These were the rules of survival every enslaved child absorbed before understanding their meaning. But there was one thing Ruth could not teach her daughter to hide: the light that seemed to radiate from Seraphina's face. By age 7, her beauty was impossible to ignore. Her amber eye shifted from deep gold to honey brown with the light. Her features were perfectly symmetrical, high cheekbones, a delicate chin. Her skin was flawless, a deep brown that held warmth even in cold weather. When she smiled, which was rare, the effect was startling. The other enslaved people noticed first. They whispered in admiration and warning. Old Bessie from the kitchen, who claimed the gift of sight, told Ruth, "Keep that child hidden. That kind of pretty brings nothing but trouble. Either the men will want her or the women will hate her. Either way, it ends in blood." Ruth tried. She kept Seraphina in the cabin as much as possible, dressed her in shapeless clothes, rubbed dirt on her face, wrapped her hair tight under rough cloth. But beauty like Seraphina's could no more be concealed than the sun hidden behind a handkerchief. It shone through everything. The day that changed everything came in September 1859. The summer heat had broken, and Helena Whitmore decided to walk through the domestic work areas for one of her unannounced inspections. She appeared without warning to criticize and remind the enslaved of their place. That afternoon, she passed the laundry area just as Seraphina stepped from the cabin carrying a basket of folded linens. The girl didn't see the mistress approaching. She was focused on balancing the heavy basket, trying not to drop the carefully pressed sheets. The cloth had slipped from her head, and her hair fell in soft waves around her face. The afternoon sun caught her at just the right angle, illuminating her features with a golden light. Helena Whitmore stopped walking. She stood perfectly still, staring at the child with an expression witnesses later struggled to describe. It wasn't exactly anger, it was something deeper, more dangerous, the look of a woman confronting what she could not accept. Ruth saw the mistress and felt her blood turn to ice. She dropped the shirt she was wringing and rushed toward her daughter, but she was too late. Helena had already seen. And what Helena saw, she could never unsee. That night, Helena lay awake in her canopied bed, staring at the ceiling while her husband snored beside her. She could not stop thinking about the slave girl. She could not stop comparing. When she closed her eyes, she saw those amber irises, that perfect skin, and felt a rage building inside her that frightened even herself. How dare this child, this piece of property, possess what Helena was losing? How dare she exist at all? By morning, Helena had made her decision. She told herself it was about discipline, about maintaining proper order. She told herself the girl had been insolent, had shown disrespect, had looked at her with defiance. None of it was true. But Helena repeated the lies until she almost believed them. The truth, which she would never admit, even in her own mind, was much simpler: she could not bear to look at Seraphina. And if she could not destroy the girl's beauty, she would hide it where no one would ever see it again. Beneath the Whitmore mansion was a cellar used for storage since the house was built in 1841, a large space, nearly 40 feet long and 20 wide, with stone walls and a dirt floor. One section held the Colonel's French wines, the back portion remained unused, dark and damp, a place even house servants rarely entered. This was where Helena decided to put the girl. She gave the orders to the overseer, Thomas Crenshaw, who carried them out without question. He was paid well not to ask questions. That evening, after the Colonel retired to his study with brandy, 2 domestic slaves came to Ruth's cabin under Crenshaw's supervision. They took Seraphina while Ruth screamed and begged. They dragged her across the yard, into the main house through the back entrance, down the wooden stairs into the cellar, and chained her to an iron ring bolted into the stone wall. Ruth tried to follow, fighting like a wild animal. Crenshaw struck her across the face, knocking her down. "If you say one word about this," he told her, "I'll sell you to the traders. You'll never see this place again. Never know what happened to your girl. Understand me?" Ruth understood. She understood she was powerless. She understood her daughter had been swallowed by the earth. And she understood there was nothing she could do. The first night in the cellar, Seraphina did not understand what was happening. She cried for her mother until her voice gave out. She pulled at the chain until iron cut into her skin and blood ran down her foot. She called for help, but her voice could not penetrate the thick stone walls and heavy wooden door. No one came. No one would come. The cellar was almost completely dark. A tiny window, no bigger than a man's hand, sat high on the wall near the ceiling. It let in a thin sliver of daylight each afternoon, just enough to tell day from night. Most of the time, Seraphina existed in total blackness. She could not see her own hands before her face, could not see the walls that imprisoned her. She could only feel the cold stone beneath her and the weight of the chain on her leg. Helena established a routine that would continue 10 years. Twice a day, a kitchen slave brought a bowl of food down to the cellar, cold cornmeal mush in the morning, dinner scraps in the evening. The slave was forbidden to speak to Seraphina, forbidden to bring a light, forbidden to tell anyone about the girl in the cellar. Helena made clear that any violation meant immediate sale to the slave traders passing through Vicksburg. For the first few months, Seraphina screamed whenever the cellar door opened. She begged for release, promised to be good, to be invisible. But the slaves who brought her food could not help her even if they wanted to. They were as trapped as she was, imprisoned by a system that gave them no power, no choices. They left the food, they left, and Seraphina remained alone in the darkness. Time became meaningless. Without day or night, without work to structure her hours, days blended into weeks, weeks dissolved into months. She slept when tired, ate when food appeared, cried until she had no tears left. Then slowly, something inside her began to change. The human mind is remarkably adaptable. Faced with conditions that should have driven her to madness, Seraphina's consciousness found ways to survive. She created structure from nothingness. She counted breaths in sets of 100. She recited every word she remembered her mother saying, replaying conversations until they felt real. She traced patterns on the stone floor with her fingers, memorizing their shapes in the dark. She invented games, stories, entire worlds that existed only in her imagination. But her most important adaptation was learning to listen. The cellar sat directly beneath the main floor. Stone walls muffled most sounds, but wooden floorboards above allowed certain noises to penetrate. Pressing her ear to the wall in the right spot, she began to distinguish words, then sentences, then entire conversations. She heard everything that happened in the Whitmore household. She heard the colonel arguing with business partners about debts and declining cotton prices. She heard Helena berating house slaves for imagined failures. She heard the 3 Whitmore sons discussing plans and secrets when they thought no one listened. She heard visitors arrive and depart, whispered confessions, shouted accusations. The house above held no secret she did not eventually discover. And she remembered everything. By her second year in the cellar, Seraphina had a mental catalogue of the family's most guarded information. She knew the colonel had borrowed heavily from a New Orleans bank to cover hidden gambling debts. She knew the eldest son, William, had fathered a child with a free black woman in Vicksburg and paid her for silence. She knew the middle son, Robert, stole family silver to fund his drinking. She knew the youngest, Thomas Jr., was terrified of his mother and often cried himself to sleep. She also knew things about Helena. She knew the mistress had once pushed a house slave down the stairs, causing her to lose an unborn baby, and convinced everyone it was an accident. She knew Helena doctored household accounts, skimming money into a private fund hidden from her husband. She knew Helena forged a letter 20 years earlier to destroy her own sister's engagement, a secret never shared. This knowledge became Seraphina's most precious possession. In the darkness, where she had nothing else, she had power. Not power to escape, not yet, but the power of knowing, of waiting, of understanding her enemies better than they understood themselves. The years passed with agonizing slowness. Seraphina grew from child to young woman entirely within that cellar. Her body adapted as best it could. The chain left a permanent scar around her ankle, a ring of thickened skin that would mark her for life. Muscles weakened from lack of movement. Her skin, once healthy brown, grew ashen from never seeing sunlight. Her remarkable amber eyes developed the ability to see in near-total darkness, like a creature evolved for life underground. But her mind grew stronger. Without external stimulation, she turned inward, developing a memory so precise she could recall conversations from years earlier word for word. She taught herself to think in organized patterns, to analyze information, to connect disparate pieces of knowledge. She played mental chess against herself, developing increasingly complex strategies. Unknowingly, she was training herself to become something the Whitmore family could never have imagined. She was becoming dangerous. Her mother, Ruth, tried to reach her. For the first 3 years of Seraphina's imprisonment, Ruth bribed a kitchen slave to pass whispered messages through the food deliveries. "Your mama loves you. Stay strong. I'm still here." These fragments kept Seraphina from losing hope entirely. But in the winter of 1862, the messages stopped. Weeks turned to months with no word. Finally, Seraphina overheard a conversation between Helena and the housekeeper. Ruth had died. Pneumonia. She worked through a fever, too afraid of punishment to rest, and her lungs filled with fluid. She was buried in an unmarked grave in the slave cemetery behind the cotton fields. Seraphina did not cry. She had exhausted her tears years before. Instead, she felt something new crystallizing inside her, cold, hard, patient, like a diamond forming under impossible pressure. It was hatred, not hot, explosive anger, but the kind that could wait, that could plan, that could endure anything to achieve its purpose. Now she knew exactly what that purpose would be. The war had already begun. Seraphina heard endless conversations through the floorboards. In April 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter, and the South erupted in celebration. The Whitmore household was caught in patriotic fervor. The colonel gave speeches on states' rights and Southern honor. The sons argued over who would enlist first. Helena organized sewing circles for Confederate uniforms. They believed the war would be short, glorious, the Yankees defeated within months. Seraphina knew better. She heard the colonel's private talks with less optimistic associates. She heard whispered concerns about British neutrality, the Union naval blockade, the difficulty of winning a war of attrition against a more industrialized enemy. By 1862, war's reality began penetrating even the plantations' isolation. Cotton prices collapsed as the blockade prevented exports. William came home from Tennessee with a bullet in his shoulder and stories of carnage that silenced the dinner table. Supplies grew scarce. Overseers were drafted, replaced by older men and boys who couldn't maintain control. The enslaved grew restless, sensing change, feeling the world they knew beginning to crack. In her cellar prison, Seraphina waited. She had been in darkness 5 years now, learning the most important lesson darkness could teach: patience was power. Silence was strength. What people tried to bury had a way of rising again. She was 17. She hadn't seen sunlight since she was 7. She hadn't heard a kind word since her mother died. She had no reason to believe her situation would ever change. But she knew, with certainty beyond logic, that her time would come. The house above was crumbling. She heard it in every worried conversation, every angry argument, every desperate prayer. The Whitmore family was running out of money, out of allies, out of time. The world that built their wealth and power was collapsing, and they were too blind to see. But Seraphina saw. In the darkness where they had thrown her, she saw everything. And she was ready. The spring of 1864 brought changes Seraphina tracked through sounds above. Conversations grew desperate. She heard Helena argue with the colonel about selling land to cover debts. She heard William, permanently weakened, discuss defeat with his brothers. She heard house servants moving with less caution, speaking more freely. The balance of power was shifting, and everyone felt it. Food deliveries became irregular. Sometimes a full day passed with nothing. She learned to stretch meager rations, to ignore the constant gnaw of hunger. Her body adapted to near starvation, thin, wiry, requiring less to survive. This wasn't strength, it was biological desperation. But it meant when others might have died, she endured. In November 1864, she heard through the floorboards about Sherman's march. Union General William Sherman was cutting a path of destruction through Georgia, burning everything from Atlanta to the sea. The terror in Helena's voice was unmistakable. If Sherman turned north into Mississippi, if Union troops reached Warren County, everything they built would be destroyed. Seraphina listened to their fear, and for the first time in 7 years, she smiled. The winter of 1864-65 was the hardest the plantation had ever known. The Confederate economy was in total collapse. Paper money was nearly worthless. Most slaves had run away, heading north toward Union lines or disappearing into the chaos. Overseers had long abandoned their posts. Fields lay fallow, cotton rotting unpicked. Helena reduced the household staff to 3 enslaved people with nowhere else to go. She dismissed the cook and worked the kitchen herself, something she'd never done. Meals grew simpler. The wine cellar was emptied and sold. Silver was pawned piece by piece for necessities. The great house, once a symbol of wealth and power, showed neglect. Paint peeled from columns. Shutters hung crooked. Gardens grew wild with weeds. Through all this, Seraphina remained in her cellar prison. Helena seemed to have forgotten her entirely, too consumed with disaster above ground to remember the girl she'd buried alive. Food deliveries grew more sporadic. Sometimes 3 or 4 days passed without the cellar door opening. Seraphina survived on rainwater seeping through the tiny window and rats caught bare-handed in the dark. She had become something less than human and more than human at the same time, stripped down to pure will and burning purpose. On April 9, 1865, General Robert E. Lee surrendered to General Ulysses South Grant at Appomattox Court House. The war was over. The Confederacy was dead. And somewhere in the darkness beneath the Whitmore mansion, a young woman imprisoned nearly 6 years heard the news through the floorboards and knew her moment was finally approaching. Weeks after the surrender, chaos came to Warren County. Union troops moved through, enforcing terms of defeat and spreading word of emancipation. Plantation owners who ruled like kings faced collapse. Some fled. Some took their own lives. Others, like the Whitmores, refused to believe their world had ended. Helena continued running her household as if nothing changed. She gave orders with the same imperious tone, spoke of the situation as temporary, a setback soon corrected when proper order was restored. Her denial bordered on madness. The colonel, broken by loss, retreated to his study and drank himself into stupor daily. The 3 sons scattered. William went to Vicksburg to salvage business interests. Robert disappeared entirely, fleeing gambling debts. Thomas Jr., the youngest, stayed at the plantation, too afraid to leave, too weak to be useful. And in the cellar, Seraphina waited. She had waited nearly 6 years. She could wait a little longer. The moment came on a warm evening in late May. Seraphina listened as always, tracking movements above. She heard Helena retire to her bedroom. She heard the colonel's drunken snoring from his study. She heard Thomas Jr. pacing his room, too anxious to sleep. Then she heard something new, the cellar door opening at an unusual hour. A figure descended the stairs carrying a candle. The light, dim as it was, seemed blinding to Seraphina's darkness-adapted eyes. She shrank back, shielding her face. For a moment, she thought Helena had finally come to kill her, to eliminate evidence before Union authorities discovered it. But the voice that spoke was not Helena's. It belonged to old Bessie, the same kitchen slave who had warned Ruth about Seraphina's dangerous beauty years before. Bessie was 73 now, one of the few enslaved people who remained because she was too old and weak to run. But she had never forgotten the girl in the cellar. With the old order crumbling, she decided to act. "Girl," Bessie whispered, voice cracking with age and emotion. "The war is over. You are free. Do you understand me? You are free." Seraphina lowered her hand slowly, squinting against candlelight. She hadn't seen another human face in nearly 6 years, had almost forgotten what people looked like. Bessie's weathered features, illuminated by flickering flame, seemed from a dream. Bessie had brought tools, a hammer, a chisel, stolen from the shed days earlier and hidden under her mattress. She knelt beside Seraphina and worked on the iron ring holding the chain. The metal was rusted, weakened by years of moisture. After nearly an hour, the ring broke free from the stone. Seraphina stood for the first time in years. Her legs could barely support her. Muscles had atrophied from disuse, leaving her weak as a newborn. She leaned against the wall, breathing heavily, feeling the strange sensation of standing upright after so long crouching and lying on cold stone. Bessie helped her up the stairs, one agonizing step at a time. The cellar door opened onto a hallway near the kitchen. Dark as it was, compared to the cellar's absolute blackness, it seemed flooded with light. Seraphina blinked, tears streaming as her eyes struggled to adjust. "You need to go," Bessie said. "Get away before they find you gone. Union soldiers are in Vicksburg, they'll help you." But Seraphina did not move toward the door. Instead, she looked back into the house, toward the main rooms where the Whitmore family slept. Her face, gaunt and pale from years of darkness, showed no expression. But her amber eyes, still remarkable despite everything, burned with a light that made old Bessie step back. "No," Seraphina said. Her voice was rusty from disuse, barely a whisper, but clear. "I am not leaving." "Not yet," Bessie argued. Staying was dangerous. Helena would kill her if she found out. The only sensible thing was to run and never look back. But Seraphina had not survived 6 years in that cellar by being sensible. She had survived by becoming something else, something that did not run from enemies, something that hunted them. She told Bessie to return to her cabin, pretend nothing happened, act normal in the morning. "Whatever happens," Seraphina said, "you did not see me. You know nothing. Understand?" Bessie understood. She had lived her entire life under people who destroyed what they could not control. She recognized that quality in Seraphina's eyes. Whatever the girl had become in those years of darkness, she was not a victim anymore. She was far more dangerous. That night, while the Whitmore family slept, Seraphina explored the house she had only known through sounds. She moved silently through hallways, bare feet making no noise on wooden floors. The layout matched the map in her mind from years of listening to footsteps and voices above. She knew which floorboards creaked, which doors squeaked, where everyone slept and when they woke. She found Helena's private office on the 2nd floor, a small room where the mistress kept personal papers. The door was locked, but the lock was old and poorly maintained. Seraphina worked it with a hairpin from a dresser, using skills never taught but intuited during isolation. The lock clicked open within minutes. The office was exactly as she imagined, a writing desk by the window, a cabinet against the wall, stacks of papers and ledgers organized with Helena's precision. Seraphina moved methodically, examining each document by thin moonlight. Her eyes, more comfortable in darkness, had no trouble reading. She found everything she was looking for, and more. Doctored household accounts proving Helena stole from her husband for years. Letters documenting the cover-up of the slave woman's death on the stairs. Correspondence with New Orleans lawyers revealing the full extent of family debts, worse than even the colonel knew. And she found something unexpected, a letter from a Natchez doctor dated 1858 confirming Helena was barren and the 3 sons were purchased from a slave trader dealing in light-skinned children who could pass for white. This last discovery was staggering. The Whitmore sons were not Whitmores at all. They were enslaved women's children, bought as infants and raised as white aristocrats. Helena maintained this deception over 30 years, terrified the truth would destroy her social standing and marriage. It was her most closely guarded secret. Now it belonged to Seraphina. She took the most important documents and hid them outside the house in a location identified during her exploration. Then she returned to the cellar, closing the door behind her. At dawn, she was back in familiar darkness, the chain arranged around her ankle to look still attached. No one would know she had ever left. For 2 weeks, Seraphina continued nocturnal explorations. She grew stronger each day, exercising in darkness, rebuilding wasted muscles. She ate better now, taking food from the kitchen at night. Color returned to her skin. Movements became fluid, controlled. She was preparing for what was to come. During days, she listened. She learned William returned from Vicksburg with terrible news, remaining assets seized by Union authorities. The New Orleans bank demanded immediate repayment of the colonel's gambling debts, threatening legal action, creditors circled like vultures. Helena's response was to double down on denial. She insisted they could rebuild, the old ways would return, they needed only to hold on. But her voice held a desperate, brittle quality Seraphina recognized. The mistress was losing control. Her carefully constructed world was falling apart, and she had no idea the final blow would come from beneath her own feet. Seraphina chose her moment carefully. On a Sunday morning in mid-June, while the family was at breakfast, she emerged from the cellar for the last time. She had washed in the kitchen basin and dressed in clothes taken from a storage trunk, old and slightly too large, but clean. She brushed her hair, pinned it up simply. For the first time in nearly 6 years, she looked almost human. She walked into the dining room without a sound. The family sat around the long mahogany table, picking at a meager breakfast of cornbread and weak coffee. Helena at one end, the Colonel at the other, Thomas Jr. between them, eyes fixed on his plate. None noticed her at first. Then Helena looked up and screamed, a sound barely human, the scream of someone seeing a ghost, the dead rising, a nightmare made flesh. She knocked over her chair, stumbling backward against the wall, eyes wide with terror. The Colonel stared in confusion. He had never known about the girl in the cellar. To him, this was a strange young black woman who had entered his home. His first instinct was to call for help, to have this intruder removed. But there was no one left to call. "Good morning," Seraphina said, voice calm and clear, stronger now. "I believe we have matters to discuss." Helena found her voice. "Get out," she hissed. "Get out of my house. I'll have you whipped. I'll have you killed." "You will do nothing," Seraphina interrupted, tone almost gentle but with steel beneath. "You will sit and listen. Because I have things to tell your husband he needs to hear." The Colonel looked between Seraphina and his wife, seeing Helena's terror without understanding its source. "What is the meaning of this? Helena, who is this woman?" "That," Seraphina said, "is an excellent question. Why don't you tell him, Mrs. Whitmore? Tell him where I've been the past 6 years. Tell him what you did to a 7-year-old child because you couldn't bear to look at her face." And she told him. She told him everything, the cellar, the chain, the years of darkness and isolation, near starvation, rats, absence of human contact. She described it all in simple, precise language without emotion, as if giving courtroom testimony. The Colonel listened in growing horror. Whatever his faults, whatever his complicity in slavery, he had never sanctioned anything like this. He believed himself a gentleman of honor. That his wife imprisoned a child in their cellar for years, tortured her with isolation and neglect, was almost beyond comprehension. Helena denied it. She called Seraphina a liar, a runaway, a thief who broke into their home. But her denials were weak, contradicted by her terror when Seraphina appeared. And when Seraphina produced documents from inside her dress, Helena's face went white. "These are from your private office," Seraphina said. "The household accounts you doctored for years. Letters about the woman who fell down the stairs. And this 1-inch," she held up the Natchez doctor's letter, "is particularly interesting." Helena lunged, trying to snatch the paper, but Seraphina was faster. She stepped aside easily, and Helena crashed into the dining table, sending dishes to the floor. "Your sons," Seraphina said, addressing the Colonel directly. "They are not your sons. They are not your wife's sons. They were purchased from a slave trader in 1829, 1831, and 1834. Light-skinned children who could pass for white. Your wife has lied to you over 30 years. The Colonel stared at the letter in Seraphina's hand. His face went grey. He looked at Helena, sobbing now, collapsed against the table, her carefully constructed world finally crumbling. Thomas Jr. sat frozen, unable to process what he heard. Everything he believed about himself, his family, his place in the world was destroyed in minutes. He was not a Whitmore. He was not white. He was the son of a slave, purchased like property, raised in a lie. The Whitmore family's destruction happened quickly after that morning. The Colonel, confronted with his wife's deception, suffered a stroke within hours. He survived but was paralyzed on his left side and could no longer speak clearly. He spent remaining years in a wheelchair, cared for by servants now free and paid wages the family could no longer afford. Helena was arrested 2 days later. Seraphina sent copies of the most incriminating documents to the Union military commander in Vicksburg, along with a detailed account of her imprisonment. Occupation authorities, seeking to demonstrate commitment to justice in the defeated South, found Helena Whitmore, a wealthy white woman who imprisoned a child in a cellar 6 years, a perfect example. A military tribunal tried her, sentenced her to 15 years in prison. She died of typhoid fever in her cell less than 2 years later. The 3 Whitmore sons scattered. William, the eldest, could not accept the truth about his origins. 3 weeks after the revelation, he put a pistol in his mouth and pulled the trigger. Robert, the middle son, disappeared, never heard from again. Some said he went west to California, others said he drank himself to death in a New Orleans boarding house. Thomas Jr., the youngest, reacted differently. He sought out Seraphina after everything fell apart and begged for information about his real mother. She could tell him little, records incomplete, the trail cold after so many years, but she told him what she knew. She watched something change in his eyes. He eventually moved north to Philadelphia, where he lived as a black man the rest of his life, teaching in a school for freedmen's children. The Whitmore plantation was seized by the federal government and redistributed to formerly enslaved people under General Sherman's Special Field Orders No. 15. The Great White House was divided into apartments for 3 black families. Cotton fields were parceled into small farms. The world James and Helena Whitmore built was not just destroyed, it was transformed into something they would have found unimaginable, a community of free people living on land they owned, building lives that belonged to them. And Seraphina walked away. She left Warren County in summer 1865 and headed north. She had no money, no possessions, no living family. But she had something more valuable: she had survived. She had triumphed. She had taken everything from those who tried to destroy her. And she had done it not with violence, but with truth. The secrets they tried so hard to keep became weapons of their destruction. She made her way to Memphis, then St. Louis, then Chicago. She worked as a domestic servant, seamstress, cook. She saved carefully, spending only what was necessary to survive. And she taught herself to read and write using discarded newspapers and books from houses where she worked. The same mind that kept her sane in darkness, that memorized years of overheard conversations, mastered the written word with ease. By 1870, Seraphina saved enough to open a small boarding house in Chicago's growing black community. She ran it 23 years, providing clean rooms and hot meals to black travelers turned away from white establishments. She never married. Never had children. When asked about her past, she said only she grew up in Mississippi and left after the war. She did not speak of the cellar. She did not speak of the Whitmores. That chapter was closed. But she kept one thing from those years: the chain that bound her ankle nearly 6 years, stored in a small wooden box under a floorboard in her bedroom. The iron had rusted, links weakened, but it remained recognizable. Sometimes late at night, she took it out, held it, felt its weight, remembered. She kept it not from sentiment, but as a reminder of what human beings could do to each other, a reminder of what she endured and overcame, a reminder that no matter how dark the darkness, there was always a way back to light. Seraphina Drake died in Chicago on February 14, 1912. She was 60 years old. The Chicago Defender obituary described her as a respected businesswoman and pillar of her community. It mentioned her boarding house, her charitable work with newly arrived Southern migrants, her quiet dignity and strength. It did not mention Mississippi. It did not mention the Whitmores. It did not mention the cellar. But there were those who knew. Old Bessie, who lived until 1889, told the story to her grandchildren before she died. Some formerly enslaved from the Whitmore plantation shared whispered accounts of the girl who emerged from darkness and destroyed her captors with nothing but truth. The story passed down generations, changing as oral histories do, becoming more legend than fact. Perhaps that is fitting, because Seraphina Drake's story is not just one woman's story. It is the story of everyone buried alive by injustice who found a way to rise. It is the story of secrets oppressors try to hide and truth that always surfaces. It is the story of beauty that could not be destroyed, a spirit that could not be broken, and a vengeance as patient as it was complete. Helena Whitmore tried to bury Seraphina in darkness because she could not bear to look at her. She thought hiding the girl away could make her not exist. She thought chains, stone walls, years of isolation would destroy what she could never possess. She was wrong. The darkness did not destroy Seraphina. It forged her. It made her sharper, stronger, more patient than any enemy could imagine. It taught her to listen when others spoke carelessly, to remember when others forgot, that the cruelty of the powerful is always built on secrets, and secrets are the most fragile foundations of all. In the end, Helena Whitmore was undone not by force, but by truth, not by violence, but by patience, not by hatred, but by the simple, unstoppable power of a human being who refused to be erased. She spent years trying to hide Seraphina from the world. But the world finds what is hidden. And sometimes what emerges from darkness is more powerful than what put it there. This is the story of Seraphina Drake, the prisoner of beauty, the girl in the cellar, the woman who waited 10 years in darkness and emerged to bring light to those who wronged her. Her story was buried over a century, lost in the vast ocean of suffering that was American slavery. But stories like hers have a way of surfacing. They rise through cracks in history. They demand to be heard because truth cannot be chained forever. And beauty, real beauty, the beauty of the human spirit, can survive anything. Even 6 years of darkness. Even a lifetime of injustice. Even the determined cruelty of those who fear what they cannot control. Seraphina Drake knew this. She learned it in the cellar beneath the Whitmore mansion, in endless darkness where she should have been destroyed. She carried that knowledge the rest of her life. And now, more than a century after her death, her story carries it forward still. Some chains are iron. Others are secrets and lies. Both can be broken. Both will be broken. It is only a matter of time. And Seraphina had all the time in the world.